is not in the room. So I'm going to scroll through the list and check who I know. And I'm going to ask Reverend Kozanai. Good morning. I saw you. Please, could you start us off with a prayer? You on mute, Rev? Please unmute yourself. There we go.
Okay, now you are hearing me now, okay?
Yes, yes, we are. Yes, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. So shall we pray? Dear Heavenly Father, we glorify your name and we thank you, oh God, this morning for gathering us together here in this Zoom meeting, discussing and planning for the keeping of our earth. May you, oh Lord, guide us as we go through our program till we finish. We thank you for your presence and for your guidance. Thank you, Father. We pray all.
Thank you, Rev.
Thank
Amen.
you.
Thank you. Celeste, I'm going to ask you, because I see you are online. Can I ask you if you could give us a second prayer, please?
Yes, certainly. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to keep my video off because signal's always an issue.
That's fine.
And so as we come together today, we just want to say, sorry, Creator Spirit, thank you for embodying us the way that you do. Thank you for filling us through all of our senses, through every breath, through every touch, in the way that we can be with each other. We acknowledge that we are a part of this interconnected web of life, that even as we come together, when we discuss our environment, we hold that awareness that in your creation of the sky, of light, of darkness, of waters, of land, of animals and plants, that we are all a part of your creation. And so we ask that as you embody us with your spirit, that you will help us to be guided towards your will, and that in your will, we are able to fulfill the ultimate purpose. And so may it be. And amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Celeste. I know that it's that I asked you and Reverend Kozanai kind of the spur of the moment, but as technology always shows us that these things we have to be ready for. So thank you very much for taking that on. Just to reiterate, the topic that we're going to discuss this morning is assessing the key outcomes of COP27 and highlighting the priorities of COP28. So because we are in a very unique position of faith leaders, we have this opportunity to highlight our own ideas and what we want to see in COP28 this year. So Francesca, I'm going to invite our Executive Director, Francesca de Gasparis, just to tell us why we gathered here today and what we would like the session to be about. Good morning, Francesca.
Good morning, Zainab, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Zainab, for opening us up and for holding the fort. It's really wonderful to be here with everyone today. And I know there's a lot of interest amongst us all on what is happening with the climate change negotiations and the impact that it's having on us, on our communities, and in the region, in Southern and East Africa. So it's wonderful to be here together this morning to look into that. As you all know, I'm going to give you a short little mini introduction to SAFCEI, which I always do, just to remind you who we are. And we are the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute. We are your Environment Institute. We work with faith communities across the region because we believe that it is in community, it is in the collective that the solutions and the way through crisis will be found. So we believe that it is only through working together in this collective space that we have the potential and the capacity to address the challenges that we face. So this is very important to us when we convene. We want to recognize everyone in the room. As Zainab said, old friends and new. For SAFCEI, our focus has been for some time on energy and climate justice. What does justice mean to people in Africa? What does it mean in terms of addressing past and current and future injustices and inequalities? And we also look specifically at the issues of food and climate justice. Food is such a critical cultural and essential part of all of our lives. It speaks to where we come from, our ancestry, our faith, and where we're going, what we want for the future for our children and for all beings that live on this precious earth. And within the Food and Climate Justice Program, we also look at, we have a small program called the Animal Justice Program. And our colleague Zweli looks specifically at this issue of how do we treat animals with the same sanctity and sacredness of life as we want to treat each other. How do we find dignity across creation? And so Zweli can tell you more about that, but probably another time, because for today we're focused on the climate change negotiations. What is this issue of climate change as it pertains to our lived experiences? And what is happening in terms of the ongoing international discussions across the globe. And you know that today we have with us our wonderful host is Zainab. She is our faith leader, environmental advocacy training coordinator. So many of you will have attended a fleet, that's what we call them, and she is the person who will know best. We also have our overall organizer is Gabriel, and Gabriel is the Food and Climate Justice Manager. And then also we have with us behind the scenes and supporting us very competently, Patiswa, who works in comms, Olwetu, who supports the programs team, and Judy Rose. And then also there's a host even further behind who you cannot see, that's Tamsin, who is live streaming for us today. So thank you to the team. Thank you for all the hard work. It takes the village of SAFCEI to make sure these events run well. And I just want to appreciate my colleagues at this moment. So I also want to now introduce you to our speakers for this morning. We are very privileged and thrilled to have with us three real experts within the region on climate change and climate justice. And they were selected because of their knowledge base and because of their unique perspectives that they're going to be able to bring to us. Firstly, we have Dr. Augustine Njamshi from PACJA. And Dr. Augustine has been following the climate change negotiations. Many of you will know the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, an important partner across the region. And he will be taking us firstly through the outcomes of COP27 and their implications. Then we've got Dr. Isaac Tchuwa from Malawi. And I want to apologize if I've mispronounced anyone's names in advance. I have not heard some of the names out loud before, so I'm doing my best to pronounce your names correctly. So I hope that's okay. Dr. Isaac is from Malawi University of Science and Technology. So he'll also be giving us more information on the status of the loss and damage as a thematic area for Africa in particular, and its impacts and implications for us. And then we have an old friend of SAFCEI's, a dear colleague, Ngoni Edwards. He's from the Jesuit Center of Ecology and Development. And Ngoni is a Pan-Africanist himself. He originally hails from Zimbabwe. He studied his master's in climate science in Cape Town, and this is how I know him well. He's one of our fleeters, and now he lives in Malawi. So we've got a great Malawian representation today. And among these esteemed three gentlemen, I'm going to represent my gender, and I'm going to do the final presentation of the morning, looking at de-jargoning this language of climate change. Some of us will be very familiar with the acronyms and jargon and language that they use in these negotiations, and other of us find it difficult to get our heads around it. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time exploring that with everyone and hearing also from you about how you explain these complex concepts to everyday people. So thank you, everyone. I think we're going to have a very lively and interesting meeting this morning. And I believe I'm handing back to Zainab again for the first presenter. Thanks, Zainab.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for that introduction to SAFCEI and also an overview of what we're doing here this morning. Just house rules, as you have seen on the slides, for those that's been here early, please keep your microphone on mute. I would ask you to keep your video off as well, just in terms of network for those who are struggling with network, because it makes it difficult for others. And but not the speakers. The speakers, obviously, their video needs to be on and their microphone. So everyone else, please, your microphone for any disturbances. So as Francesca has said, we will start with Dr. Augustine Njamshi. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm speaking from Cameroon, the heart of the Congo Basin, and one of the hardest hit on climate change, by impacts of climate change. People always ignore. They think that when you are in the forest, the impacts of climate change are not felt. In fact, we see what is happening here in Congo, in Cameroon, in everywhere around the Congo Basin, then you'll be shocked to know that climate change has no boundaries. So I would like to thank the organizers, especially Gabriel, who has been behind me for close to a month to be part of this meeting. And we take the faith community very seriously in this fight for climate justice, because you bring the moral voice, you speak to the minds of the people, and this cannot be ignored. Currently, the activities we have on adaptation in Cameroon have very much done through the faith groups, because communities are always organized in such groups. So that is why, as Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, the faith group or the sector is a very cardinal sector in our advocacy. and we've always worked with faith groups, All African Conference of Churches, Act Alliance, all those people, and we cannot avoid being in this space. Again, thank you for this opportunity. I've been told to, Gabriel, how long do I have to speak? So that I may know.
You speak for 25 minutes, then we'll also need to have a discussion with you for 5 minutes. Thank you.
All right. Let someone help me share my screen.
You can share.
Yes, okay. Let me go back and see what I have on the screen. Point, yeah. Point. Share screen. Sorry, Scott, I find you to help me share my PowerPoint quickly, please. Sometimes I don't know how to manipulate these computers. They're the computers of the office, so I'm sorry. While they come to help me to share the screen, please, we need to understand a few things about climate change. I know you've done that before, but as far as Africa is concerned, Article 41E of the Convention talks of Africa as a continent with special needs and circumstances. And this basically because, just let me share this. Is the screen? Can you see my screen, please? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Can you put it into a slideshow? Can you play the slideshow so that it's bigger?
Yes. All right. Slideshow.
Yes, we're able to see your screen.
All right, thanks. They are putting it into slideshow for me. Is this slide of number one? Just like me.
There we go.
Good. All right. This one.
This is to go back.
Okay, thanks. All right, thank you so much. This is my communication team trying to help me. COP27, I've been told to talk a little bit about the outcomes, the major outcomes of COP27, how it affects or how it will relate to the Southern African region. I would rather talk about Africa as a whole because Southern African region is part of Africa, although there are some specificities, but I mean, the continent as a whole is in danger. So COP27, that was the 27th Conference of the Parties that took place in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. Coming in Sharm el-Sheikh, we said the COP that is taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh this time, or in Egypt this time, should not be again called the COP of Africa or African COP. Because before we had the one in Egypt, we've had 4 Conference of the Parties on the African continent. Each time it takes place on the continent, they always say this is an African COP. But it doesn't mean anything because when the results don't even reflect the aspirations and the needs and concerns of the African people, then the name, the baptismal name African COP becomes some kind of a mockery. How do we keep calling an African COP when the results don't reflect the aspirations of the people? So as the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance in particular, and the African Civil Society Fraternity in general, we said, let it be termed the COP of African people. And that name will only be taken if the results reflect the aspirations and the needs and concerns of the African people themselves. You know, we can have an African COP in Dubai. We can have an African COP in Europe if the name of the Conference of the Parties is based on the outcome that meets the needs of the people. So was it a COP of the African people? We shall see in the conclusion after going through all the outcomes. Before we go to COP, the African group usually brings what we call the African common position. They have key positions on the various streams. And for a reminder, for the first time in 2009, the African common position took the world by storm, because that was for the first time that the African people, the African civil society, the group of negotiators, the political leaders came together and had a common position for the Conference of the Parties. And that was in 2009 in Copenhagen. That took the world by surprise. From there on, the duty has been to harness and nurture and keep together this common position. Although practically, sometimes countries, because of their selfish needs, may derail from there because they want to gain something for their countries. Of course, each African country is sovereign and can define its foreign policy. But we are only stronger when we negotiate together. I'm just coming back from from South Africa, where the Kenyan president said, can we, for instance, negotiate, can a country of maybe 25 million people negotiate with 400 million of the European Union? So what does this mean? It means once we are together, we have a common position as a people, then it is possible to negotiate from a stronger point. So each time the African group of negotiators, which is the technical wing or the technical level of negotiations, puts these positions together technically and take them for negotiations at the Conference of the Parties. Africa negotiates at 4 levels, I will guess. The African group of negotiators, which are these technicians, the focal points in the ministries in charge of climate change or environment in the various countries, that become focal points of the Convention on Climate Change. That is a purely technical negotiation. At a higher level, we have what we call the African Ministerial Conference on Environment, AMCEN, which is the conference of the ministers that are in charge of environment and, of course, climate change, that come together to look at what the technicians have put together. They give a political undertone to it, and then take it to the higher level, which is Conference of Heads of States on Climate Change, CAHOS. For now, the pioneer chair of that group, which was only created in 2009 in preparation for Copenhagen, was led Prime Minister of Ethiopia called Meles Zenawi. Henceforth, since then, it has been rotating, and currently that position is held by the Kenyan President William Ruto. So, in order to analyze the outcome of Sharm el-Sheikh, we want to put it against the key positions that this African group of negotiators, or the African position that was taken to Sharm el-Sheikh, and then see the outcome in reflecting that common position, and then give our take as civil society. I think this is how we're going to put this presentation. So, the first point was the special needs and circumstances of the continent. I said before that the Convention on Climate Change in its Article 41E considers Africa as a continent with special needs and circumstances. What does this mean? It is a scientific position, it is a geopolitical position, It is social and cultural and everything embedded. Science says Africa has the potential of warming more than 1.5 times the global mean temperature. That means if the temperature, the global mean temperature or the global average temperature is 2 degrees, Africa has the potential of warming about 3.5 or more degrees Celsius or centigrade. That is going to be unbearable. And this is proven. You know, with the current slightly above 1 degrees Celsius of global mean temperature, you see what is happening. In the Southern African zone, for instance, the other day I was in Malawi. You see the impact of cyclone Freddy in Mozambique, South Africa as a country. All those Southern African countries are suffering from what we have now, current temperatures, with these cyclones and whatever, droughts and all those things. So imagine a time when the global mean temperature will be 2 degrees. So in Paris in 2015, the African group of negotiators said, as it is mentioned in the convention in Article 41E, taking care of special needs and circumstances of Africa, as proven by science, it should also be reflected in the Paris Agreement. It didn't have traction there. We didn't gain that support. So the French presidency or the COP presidency postponed that to the next COP, which was in Marrakesh. From there on, it has always been the special, it has always been the priority of African group of negotiators. Over the years, therefore, it has never been taken into consideration. So we thought, because it's always postponed to the next COP, it can be decided, discussed in the next COP, but it never features even on the agenda. We are hoping that Egypt, being the COP presidency, and that has been that country that has been pushing this agenda item, we thought it would be a letter in the post in Sharm el-Sheikh. Unfortunately, the forces against it were more, and it could not even be mentioned in the agenda. So from this, the issue of special needs and circumstances again failed us in Sharm el-Sheikh. On adaptation, the African position was adaptation should be grant-based and that the global goal on adaptation should be accelerated. What is the global goal on adaptation? For the mitigation, we have this global goal on temperature, which is 2 degrees Celsius for now, with the ambition of getting it to 1.5. And in fact, for this temperature goal, right in Copenhagen, the African group of negotiators said, following this science, it should be well below 1.5 degrees because 2 degrees is death for Africa, and you can see already. So there is no commensurate goal in the adaptation facet of these negotiations. So over the years, they have been negotiating. There is a need for a global goal on adaptation. The African group was therefore saying, adaptation should be grant-based financing, and then the adaptation goal should be accelerated. What is the outcome on this agenda item? They said with the Sharm el-Sheikh plan of implementation recognize the gap, the adaptation gap as presented by the United Nations Environment Programme and the lack of these adaptation goals. So they decried that gap and said something should be done to accelerate the implementation or the decision on global goal on adaptation. And that they should scale up climate finance on adaptation. Currently, ladies and gentlemen, the adaptation finance has been struggling. CPI figures say in 2019 to 2020, the global finances for climate change were $632 billion. Out of these $632 billion, only $46 billion were dedicated to adaptation. And $15 billion was dedicated for dual use, that is adaptation, mitigation, and others. So this shows how insignificant adaptation finance has been in the agenda or in the global agenda. Even when you look at the 100 billion per year goal on climate finance that was adopted years ago, although we have not yet had the 100 billion, what we have there is, which is about 80-something billion, adaptation is only between 20 and $21 billion. So in what do they call it? In Glasgow, they committed themselves, the international community committed in doubling adaptation finance. Now the question we've been asking as civil society, are you doubling the $21 billion? Are you doubling the $46 billion that is the CPI figures that take into consideration all climate finance? And even then, if they double it, it will still be grossly insufficient. Yesterday, the African Development Bank president in Sharm el-Sheikh, in their conference, the annual conference of the bank, said Africa alone needs $2.7 trillion by 2030 for adaptation, for climate action in the continent. So following this decision, we say our take is a clear lack of targets and whether weak language that cannot spur ambition to make people produce the adaptation finance that is needed, at least for this continent. The next one is energy and just transition. We understand clearly that the impacts of climate change that we're having today have come out of the greenhouse gas emissions that are concentrated in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution of 1832 to today. So the consequences of this are felt more in Africa than anywhere else. When we keep talking about this, people tell us of countries. We are talking of Africa as a continent. Africa is the most impacted continent, if you take it holistically from that position. And we know the cause has been the fossil energy use that, marked the Industrial Revolution. And it continues even today. Africa's key position on this, the group of negotiators' key position on this was, and which we don't totally agree, that there should be no unplanned and abrupt divestment from fossil fuels. What do they mean? They say we have to be given enough time to move away from fossil fuel because we need energy for our own development, which somehow is true. We need energy for our own development. And they think we should continue to use the fossil fuels, the gas, the coal that is available, and slowly win ourselves. Reverend Joshua is talking. Should I wait? Hello?
You can continue.
Okay, thank you. So we should slowly win ourselves out of fossil dependency and not an abrupt thing that can crumble the economies. And then that there are multiple forms of just transition and just transition financing framework. There should be a just transition financing framework for Africa and adaptation to just transition as well. The relevant outcomes from Sharm el-Sheikh, they recognize the energy mix, low emissions, renewable energy, diversified systems, Then taking into consideration the national differentiated circumstances of each country or of the continent. And then that there are multiple pathways to just transition, energy, social, economic, labor, and other dimensions, and phase down, but not phase out, unabated coal, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So our take on this is, following the African Group of Negotiators position, the position was widely covered in this, that they recognize the low emission energy mix, diversified systems, and they take into consideration the national differences or national circumstances. But there's weak language. This weak language ushers in the low emergency to remove energy tight emissions. What do we mean? It is like giving people a window to sleep and not take concrete action and fast action to phase out this fossil fuels dependency or fossil emissions from energy sector. Then climate change is, we've also discovered that climate change is increasingly being framed as a just transition issue. On the issue of mitigation, the Sharm el-Sheikh plan of implementation, the African Group of Negotiators position was to scale programs to keep the global mean temperatures to below 1.5 degrees alive. The discussion should still be alive. As I said before, this position of way below 1.5 degrees Celsius was brought for the first time in the climate negotiations by the African Group of Negotiators in Copenhagen in 2009, and has been pushing on that. Then there was urgent need for international support for implementation of the conditional parts of the African countries' nationally determined contributions. May I take this a few seconds to explain what is meant here? In Paris, the Paris Agreement made countries, all countries, to take commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their countries, depending on their national circumstances. That should be determined by the national circumstances. It's something you admit you want to do yourself. Then in those indices, there's what we call conditional indices, which is conditioned on external financial technology support for the countries to be able to do it. And then there is what we call unconditional indices, which is what the countries have taken upon themselves to do it with or without any external support. So a majority, greater percentage of African countries' indices are conditional. That is conditioned on the means of implementation or on finance, or what we call means of implementation can also be called finance and even technology. So what was the outcome? The outcome of Sharm el-Sheikh says there is need to have deep and sustained reductions in emissions by 43% by 2030 relative to 2019 levels. Then they also said the discussion about non-carbon emissions will be brought on the table, and they specifically mentioned methane. And you know, methane comes mostly from the agricultural sector. And this third outcome was that there should be international support for implementation of conditional parts of NDCs in developing countries, especially Africa. So our take on this, therefore, is that there is weak ambition, because they are talking of this 1.5 degrees still in the future. Even this 43% by 2020 relative to 2019 levels cannot bring it to well below 1.5 as it is the African position. Then another concern we have is that the non-carbon emissions, especially methane, is likely to increase pressure on developing countries, especially Africa, in sectors that are supporting our economies, such as agriculture. For loss and damage, the African Group of Negotiators' position was we need an urgent and frank negotiations on loss and damage. And there should be no false solutions when we're addressing loss and damage. Then there should be the operationalization of the San Diego network on loss and damage, and that there should be some special finance facility that can help countries in Africa that are already suffering from the consequences of climate change or extreme weather conditions to cope with the present condition as we continue to negotiate the loss and damage. And that loss and damage should be a permanent priority on the agenda in all conference of the parties. That was the African position. And the relevant outcome was, happily, the establishment of funding arrangement for loss and damage. And a transitional committee to operationalize this was created. And that means this transitional committee should help operationalize this and give give it a life by COP28. That committee has had already 2 meetings, I guess, one in Egypt, another one that took place in Bonn last April. Then establishing the institutional arrangement for the San Diego network. So when you look at this position of African Group of Negotiators and the outcomes, generally it was taken into consideration. From our perspective, learning from the complexity of other financing mechanisms like GCF, JEF, and Adaptation Fund, this fund should be easily accessible as loss and damage issues cannot wait for any bankability issues. We're saying that when a catastrophe strikes, when there's drought, when there is cyclone, you can't wait to have people write bankable projects to have access to that fund. So the accessibility of this funding arrangement or of this fund that is going to be is put in place should be vital, should be primordial, because it is going to be very difficult for countries in distress to go through some hard conditions before accessing the financing or the funds. From an African civil society perspective, therefore, this is just but the beginning of a big battle, ensuring that this fund is operational, available, flexible, and easily accessible to communities at the front line of climate crisis, including arrangements that are out of the convention, because it says, that article says, this arrangement includes, complements, and includes all arrangements that are within the convention as well as out of the convention. The fear we have here, therefore, is that any bilateral fund, anything can be put together and baptized loss and damage financing. We want a situation where it is clear, it is in a basket that everybody can have control and everybody can have an eye on it. So it is important for us to keep watching out so that not everything will be put and then countries will say, we have put money in loss and damage. Meanwhile, it is full of conditions. It is having some other undertones. Then on climate finance, the key position of the African group was to increase and simplify access. As we've seen from JEF, from GCF, that is the Green Climate Fund, and other funding mechanisms that have been in place, Africa is always having a challenge of accessing aid. So in the outcomes from Sharm el-Sheikh, they say there is a need for reform of multilateral development banks and others to increase and simplify access to climate finance, create a new vision that is commensurate and operational model, use grants and guarantees and non-debt instruments. Our take is that a call for reform and simplification of access is a big win, although there is no clear position on loans despite support for grants and non-loan instruments. Finally, and summarily, can we say COP27 was an African People's Cup as we had envisioned? We think it did not really meet the aspirations of Africa to that extent, just for the simple fact that we could not have the African special needs and circumstances on the agenda before being defeated was already a very bad sign for us. Weak language on lowering the bar on ambition, especially energy transition, is also something that is a cause for concern. We think it was a missed opportunity to address African unique circumstances and concerns. I will end here and say again, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Njamshi, sorry, my apologies. That was a wealth of information that I'm sure the faith leaders are still processing. I am processing as well. There are other presentations that we're going to do after you. So I'm just going to ask people if they have any questions or comments, please add them to the comment box. I do see Mteto Lungu commenting on there, which is also very informative, and people can go read the comment box for that. If there are any questions, we'll come to it at the end. So thank you very much for the presentation, and I hope that you're staying on just in case there's questions for you. You're on mute now.
Okay, I actually have a doctor's appointment, so I can be here for the next 30 minutes only. Okay,
thank you very much. We'll see how it goes. Thank you. I don't see any urgent questions coming up so far, so we'll move on to the next presentation. Can I just ask people, if you are not presenting, please switch off your microphone so that you're not a disturbance for the presenter who's presenting. Thank you very much. Dr. Isaac Tchuwa, Dr. Isaac Tchuwa from the Malawi University of Science and Technology. Are you ready for your presentation?
Yes, Zainab. We do have the presentation.
Okay.
May you facilitate his presentation?
Thank you, Gabriel. So it's a pre-recorded presentation, so we'll just play it.
Yeah, I think I only have two slides, then I'll just be able to speak through those. So great if I could be able to share the slides.
Only you can make him co-host so that he's able to share, or give him the sharing right.
We've made the doctor co-host.
Yeah, thank you so much. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Dr. Isaac, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. Good morning once again, colleagues. It's good to be part of this conversation. So my name is Tchuwa. I work with the Malawi University of Science and Technology. There I'm a senior lecturer in climate sciences, but also currently I'm heading the Department of Earth Sciences. So I take quite an interest in climate justice issues, particularly now, issues around loss and damage. And as you might know, loss and damage, in the East Tchuwa COP27, it was quite a big issue, but it has got quite a long history. So COP27 was a watershed moment in terms of recognizing loss and damage as a major pillar in disaster risk management. So my presentation this morning will focus around issues of loss and damage. Particularly as we think ahead, to COP28, I think there's still work that needs to be done. So much as maybe we can applaud the historical moment where loss and damage has now become, one of the main talking points in terms of, managing the climate crisis, but there's still more work that needs to be done. So I think my presentation today will be making a case that, as we go into COP28, we need not to relent. We need still to keep an eye, and we still need to make more noise so that there are concrete mechanisms for financing loss and damage. So when you actually look at the commitment that was made at COP27, it is still a bit fuzzy. So there isn't any clear-cut commitments in terms of the wealthiest northern nations, defining clearly how loss and damage will be financed. So I think that's where I think much of our focus should be focusing on. So I think I will not belabor much with the trying to discuss the mechanisms and the politics around COP27. But maybe I'll just give a few quick takeaway points, and then that will provide a context for me to make an argument for really pushing for loss and damage to be a third pillar in disaster risk management. And also, from then on, I will make a case for indeed defining more concretely how loss and damage will be financed. So I think the message around COP27 should revolve around those two issues, in my opinion. So I think first of all, I would like to really just provide a bit of a conceptual context to what loss and damage is and why it matters. So I will use sort of a conceptual framework that we've developed through the work that we've done from TROCA. So just for the sake of your information, we recently conducted some work around loss and damage for TROCA Malawi. So TROCA got some funding from the Scottish government. So the Scottish government, I think you would know that it is one of those few nations that are taking loss and damage seriously. So the Scottish government has started to fund a bit of research work around this area. Malawi and Fiji, I think, are the countries that have benefited from that funding. So in Malawi, TROCA has been spearheading work around loss and damage, and it commissioned sort of a short research. So it commissioned our university to conduct research around loss and damage. So one of the key things there was to contextualize issues around loss and damage in terms of what they mean for Africa, but also what they mean for Malawi. So, that work has given us a bit of insight in terms of how maybe we can begin to conceptualize what loss and damage is, maybe in an African context. So the conceptual framework I'm presenting here is sort of a culmination of that work in terms of how we are now beginning to think through the issues of what loss and damage might look like. So it is a conceptual framework that is born out of our understanding of what disaster risk management is. So you recall that historically, when we talk about managing disaster, climate-related disasters, we focus much attention on mitigation and adaptation. So that's where even most of the financing has focused on. But you recognize that the adaptation and mitigation, they do have limits, they do have limitations. So adaptation, in other words, adaptation and mitigation, they do fail. So when they fail, you realize that countries or the poor communities, they incur certain damages. So these are damages to to life or to property or to infrastructure for that matter. So what you're going to see is that for a country such as Malawi, but it's not just unique for Malawi also, but if you look around Africa, Southern Africa in particular, you find that the climate-related disasters are increasing in severity and magnitude. Malawi, Mozambique, Madagascar, and other countries have recently been at the mercy of, persistent cyclones. And these cyclones are causing quite, untold damage and suffering, especially in the rural communities. But when you look at these communities, there's been a lot of, focus in terms of financing, adaptation, and mitigation interventions, for example. So in Malawi, I might cite, districts such as Tchuwa, Sanje, Zomba, and others. You find that, there's been quite an inflow of development aid and other forms of financing, to really build the resilience of these communities. But the recent cyclones have shown that those, interventions, they do have limits. And you go into those communities, you find that they've been set back, many years in terms of where they were and where they are now. A good example is the recent cyclone Freddy, has caused quite massive damage in most of these rural communities. So it is out of that realization that indeed, mitigation and adaptation is not a panacea to dealing with the climate crisis. So that's why we are saying that we need to find other ways of, managing, the effects, of the failure in terms of adaptation and the mitigation. So in other words, we need to find a way of managing what we call residual risk. So there's always residual risk, and this risk has to be managed in a different way. So mitigation and adaptation mechanisms might not suffice in managing those residual risks. Hence why, we are now, sort of paying more attention to issues of loss and damage. So as I indicated, since the loss and damage issue started to make international headlines in the early 90s, it was a few countries, especially the smaller island nations, Seychelles and others, that were really vocal about these issues. But it has taken so many years of back and forth negotiations for it now to make it, onto the international scene. So I think, I have in mind COP26 in Glasgow. I think this issue was discussed quite a bit. And then, that led into the COP27 discussions. But it has been quite a sticking point, because of the resistance of the, rich nations. So the rich nations have been resisting calls for recognizing loss and damage as one of the major issues within the UNFCCC, framework, and maybe in a maybe more general or maybe generalized way. This is because they are afraid of, taking up responsibility. Because once they acknowledge that the climate crisis that we are experiencing, they're partly to blame, probably they're afraid that, you could have some litigation or some lawsuits that can follow. So they've been resisting calls for recognizing loss and damage as a major pillar in disaster risk management. But now I think they are softening up. But as I mentioned, I think the commitment remains verbal. So we don't have any concrete mechanisms. But as you can see from the framework I'm presenting there, you find that, the disasters will keep causing huge losses and damages, especially in poorer nations, in poorer communities. So you're going to have a lot of factors that interplay with one another. So you can see on the left hand there that there are various factors that would interplay to cause disasters, and these obviously are structural but also non-structural, or in other ways they are physical or they're environmental and also they're political. So on the politics of it, you're looking at the current unsustainable production systems, especially, in the current development pathway that obviously has been informed by a lot of Western discourse, that has created, a lot of, greenhouse gases that are obviously causing the current warming, and that has got an effect in terms of our present climate. So these things, if you look at the science, you check even the reports from the IPCC or other independent scientists, the data, the science is unequivocal that we are going, the West is yet to come. And I think I was looking that, I think it was yesterday that we've just passed another milestone. I think the global warming has passed the 1.5 degrees Celsius milestone. And we know that that is quite significant. And the moment we get to 2 degrees, that would be a point of no return. So we know that, given the current climatic conditions, we are going to, experience, things such as extreme weather events, too much rainfall, or sometimes the cyclones, as we've been witnessing in Southern Africa, but also drought. Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa in general currently is reeling from huge famine because of the drought conditions there. So we are going to experience these extreme weather events. The science is very clear. Now, what remains to be done is how you intervene. So in the middle of the framework there, you're going to see that, you have adaptation and mitigation that we've used traditionally to deal with, these things. But there's always going to be residual risk that interplays with the, those complex factors that are, we are indicating on the left there. And these will cause losses and damages. So you're going to find that on the outer part of the framework, the dotted lines that are connecting back to disasters and to economic losses and damages, those are the pathways through which that damage can manifest itself. So we need to find a way of averting those damages. When adaptation and everything else fails, we need to find ways of averting the damages that may result from the fallout, that is coming from the current climate crisis. So that's why there is a need really to push for, innovative mechanisms in which we can deal with those disasters. I mean, we can deal with disasters that may result, from the residual risk, that is resulting from the, from the ineptness or from the ineffectiveness of losses and damages. So here is a case now for recognizing loss and damage as a third pillar in disaster risk management. There's been quite a group of, experts that have been actually arguing that loss and damage should be recognized as a standalone third pillar over and above mitigation and adaptation. But there's been resistance to do that for obvious political reasons, as I've highlighted already. But COP27 has given us an opportunity because now there's an international recognition that indeed, losses and damages resulting from failed adaptation and mitigation, are having enormous impacts in our poor communities. So I guess, as an organization, maybe you can take up an advocacy role for really pushing for these, for these poor nations, to have some sort of reparations or some sort of compensation from the climate crisis, and obviously, to force the rich nations to own up to their commitments. So the commitments that came from COP27 remains at a verbal level. So it has not been concretized into clear financing mechanisms. So we really need to push these nations to define, I think through COP28, clear mechanisms, through which the reparations will be paid or the compensations will be done. However, one of the major problems currently is that we do not have enough understanding or enough ways in which we can really begin to think about what loss and damage is, and then how that can be concretely dealt with. So here I'm actually trying to draw your attention to the lack of research in this area. So what you find is that if you look at the research around, climate change and disaster risk management, most of the focus has been on mitigation and adaptation. We know enough about those, but loss and damage, is an area that has not been financed as much in terms of research financing going to that area. So we really need more robust research to be done in this area also. So as I mentioned, the Scottish government at least has put in a bit of money into countries such as Malawi and Fiji but we find that there's still enormous work that needs to be done so that we create knowledge, enough knowledge that can inform, interventions. So this could be policy interventions or practical interventions around loss and damage. So, some of the people that have actually, been critical about loss and damage as a concept are pointing to that area as one of the critical, areas that is lacking, to say we don't know enough about this, and therefore it becomes difficult to operationalize loss and damage as a concept, and also not just as a concept but also as a practical intervention or as a policy intervention. So perhaps also, as we are defining these mechanisms, there's also a need to build research capacity. So the research capacity, here I'm trying to draw attention to the limited research capacity in our universities, but also within the third sector, within the NGOs and other organizations that are working around this area. So some of that funding needs to be invested in serious research. So this is practical oriented research I'm talking about, action research around loss and damage. So I know also that the Scottish government, I think it has committed about £7 million, and some of that funding, there are discussions that it needs to be invested in research. So perhaps that can, we can create synergies with governments, such as the Scottish government, but also Denmark. Also, I think they're starting to put serious attention to this. So perhaps we can ride at the back of those that goodwill, so that I think this becomes an area that we are also seriously focusing on. So then, I think as an organization and as a people interested in this, you need a clear advocacy strategy, and the clear strategies for really, sort of getting the governments to be on board to define more clearly what loss and damage financing mechanisms will look like, and also a way in which maybe that financing will be distributed fairly. So I'm talking about fair distribution because, for example, some of the financing that has come through, for example, the Green Climate Fund, some of the poorer nations have been struggling to access, money there because the financing mechanisms and the conditionalities around it are quite punitive. So some of the poorer southern, especially in Africa, have struggled to access that financing because number one, they don't have capacity, to maybe to write convincing proposals, and number two, to meet the stringent requirements that are there. So perhaps as we are defining, mechanisms for loss and damage, we need other innovative ways in which these countries can be enabled to access the financing. Because what you normally find sometimes is that the richer nations can promise so much money, but for you to unlock that money, it becomes almost impossible. So it is one of the tactics that they use, really, maybe to put off, the poor nations from accessing this financing. So it becomes a very unfair, sort of distribution to that financing. So we also need to pay attention to what kind of financing mechanisms, will be put in place and how fair or just they are, because, the existing, as I mentioned, some of the existing financing mechanisms for financing, adaptation and mitigation are quite stringent and are quite difficult to access. So the fairness of how this financing that will come through the loss and damage financing mechanisms, that is also another area that we need to pay much attention to. So, and we also have some housekeeping things that we need to do, especially for the poorer, for the governments in poorer countries such as my own. You find that at a policy level, we are also not well prepared, not just policy level, but also at an operational level. We are not also just prepared, for loss and damage sort of issues. So you find that most of the climate change and disaster risk management policy is also overtly, or maybe sometimes overtly focused on mitigation and adaptation. There's very little institutional mechanisms or policy mechanisms that will look more seriously around issues of loss and damage, so that we have good frameworks in place, so that once that financing comes, then it is put to use where it is intended. Otherwise, in the current setup, what you find is that most of the African governments, so here I would draw much from my own country, most of these governments, they don't have clear-cut financing mechanisms be it for mitigation adaptation, but even let alone loss and damage, which is a new thing. There are no clear-cut mechanisms. So once that money comes, it ends up in the general national budget, and it ends up going into other priorities over and above disaster risk management. So also African governments should be lobbied to create conducive policy environments in which once this funding comes, then it can, it can be transformative enough to pull people out of the, the misery of poverty, because I think underlying these issues are issues of poverty. So this financing, what it comes in, it will be put where it matters most. It will be put to building the resilience of the poorer communities. Otherwise, one of the key weaknesses in maybe not being able to access financing is that once the funders come, they make assessments of our financing arrangements or our policy arrangements, then we are always caught off guard because we are seen not to be prepared. So we fail to attract some of this financing because of our own housekeeping problems. So African governments, they should be lobbied that they need now to also start legislating, for example, around issues of loss and damage, but also they should start creating policies, that can, unlock this financing. And this financing, once it comes, you have clear institutional setup that it will be put to use to building the resilience of these poor communities. So in other ways, the work can be done, both, within the global conversation, but also there's a need to domesticate loss and damage as a concept at a national level, but also at a local level. So the African governments should be prepared. They need to put their house in order, in other ways, so that once this financing comes, then it does what it ought to do. Otherwise, currently it is quite difficult, to invest in this area because we don't have sort of unified, nationally defined sort of frameworks that can guide this work. So more often what you find is that most of the interventions are driven by NGOs or other non-governmental actors. They're the ones driving most of these interventions. Otherwise, the government, the work it does is quite piecemeal, and it does not, lead to any national sort of transformative change that can build resilience. So, for example, I'll give an example in Malawi. Currently, climate insurance is another innovative thing that is being done. But that you find that it is driven, for example, by the World Food Program. They're the ones driving it. And the government has been brought into conversation that you should take matters of climate insurance seriously. But there's been a bit of dragging there. So the governments in Africa need to prepare, and some of the lobbying has to be done around that area so that we have good and robust mechanisms that can allow for efficient and effective use of resources that will come around issues of loss and damage. So in a nutshell, from me then, is that number one, much as we have scored some gains at COP27, in recognizing loss and damage as an important area for investment, for disaster risk management, investment, or climate, investment, but more work needs to be done, operationalizing the funding. So that will require, the defining more concretely and more clearly the mechanisms through which this financing will be channeled to the poor nations. But number two, we also need to pay attention to how fair those mechanisms will be. Otherwise, there is a tendency for some of the mechanisms to be a bit exclusionary. And my other key point is that the African governments, they need to put their houses in order. So in other words, we need robust policy frameworks and also institutional setups that will allow this financing to be unlocked. And then once this financing flows to our countries, then we'll be able to put this money to build the resilience of the poor communities that are at the mercy of the climate-related disasters. So I think those are the few key points I wanted to make in the presentation. Thank you so much. I shall welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Isaac Tchuwa from the Malawi University of Science and Technology. I can see that the chat box is coming alive, and we are watching your comments and questions, which we will discuss at the end of the presentations. Yeah, so we're going to go straight on to our next speaker, who is Ngoni Edward of the Jesuit Center for Ecology and Development, who's also in Malawi. Morning, Ngoni. You on mute.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you for that. Morning, Zainab, and good morning to everyone. Greetings from Malawi again. And thanks, Dr. Isaac, for your presentation. So I will share my presentation. I think everyone can see it. Zainab, can everyone see the presentation?
Yes, you can. Can you put it on slideshow, please?
Yes, that's, thank you. So my presentation again is going in this, it's more of a reflection and a sharing, and it's going in the same kind of mode that Dr. Augustine and Isaac have created. But though there's going to be some of the spiritual element to this, some of the, I'm calling this, is more about the disposition that us as faith actors should have as we reflect on what has happened, but at the same time, again, as we move on towards the COP28. I think it's a very important time for us to stop, to pause, to review, and as well as to guide and then move together in this. So really, I'm going to offer some points for reflection as well for some kind of conversation on this subject. So what faith leaders can do in the aftermath of COP27 and preparing for COP28. I think for me, one of the first important things which we need to do is also to take stock of what has happened. What have we achieved? What have we missed? And where should we be placing ourselves? We should not allow the COP27 and some of the probably what we would call kairos moments that happened at COP27. We should not allow those moments like when we got the wins, like the lost and damaged facility. We should not allow those moments to just go and for us not to act on those moments. So we need to take stock of ourselves. We need to account to the people, account to creation, account to Mother Earth, to say, where are we, us as faith keepers, us as earth keepers, us as steward. Of course, we also need, and I think this is a very important thing for us, people of faith, this call to continuously renew ourselves, this call to continuously transform ourselves as we commit ourselves to climate justice. Not just only climate justice action, but also climate justice watching, looking at to see how is Mother Earth and the people and everyone is being cared for. Again, this is part of how we live and respond to the call and mission to care for creation. So this is what I'm going to, in the next few minutes, I'll be sharing with you. Where I'm going to start from, we usually, in my organization, which is Jesuit Center for Ecology and Development, we usually use these, what we call the 3 integral ecology reflection questions. And I'm going to also share with you and see how this can help us in thinking about this, about where are we in the aftermath of COP27 and what should we be doing in terms of preparing for COP27. So for me, I think this is the moment for us to ask ourselves these questions. What have we done for creation? I think we need in this, what have we been doing for creation? What have we been doing? But again, we know that when we talk of climate justice, when we talk of ecological justice, we also have to ask the question, what have we done for others? And ultimately, because we are people of faith, and I think this is a critical point, we are people of faith, we need also to talk, what have we done for creation and ultimately for God? What have we done? So that is, for me, one of the central questions that us as faith actors at this point of time, aftermath of COP27, preparing for COP28, we need to have this kind of a spiritual questioning of ourselves. What have we done for creation? What are we doing for creation right now, right here, at this moment, at this period of time. What are we doing for creation? Right now, because I come from the Catholic community, right now we are celebrating the Laudato Si week, where we are being invited to think about how do we inspire hope for creation and hope for humanity, hope for earth and hope for the people. So the question is, people of faith, what are we doing for creation? But we know that our relationship with creation is also a relation with each other. What are we doing with others? And ultimately, what are we doing for God? As stewards of creation, as earth keepers, what are we doing? Then the final question, what more? And this is invitation not to have this sense of arrive, that no, ours is a journey. So what more should we be doing for creation in our work of justice, climate justice, ecology work? What more should we be doing for creation? So these are questions which we are using, and I'll be going through now in those questions to invite us to have this ecological examine, this asking ourselves, this dispositioning ourselves for this work as faith keepers. So these are my friends, these are the questions which I'll be now going through.
Sorry, Ngoni, you have to move your slides so we can see the questions again.
So I'll be sharing. So I'll be. I'm sure. Okay. Are you able to see now the first?
No, we're only seeing the first slide.
Okay, I've moved it now. Okay, I don't. How's this now?
No.
Mm-hmm.
I have your slides open. Do you want me to share it for you?
Sure. I think you can share for me from that side.
Okay. Can you unslide?
Yes, sure.
Can you see?
Thank you, Zainab. So those are the questions. What have we done for creation, for others, and ultimately for God? What have we done for creation? What are we doing? What are we doing for creation, others, and ultimately for God? What more should we be doing for creation, others, and ultimately for God? And I've just said that these are questions for us to do a kind of an ecological examine as faith leaders, as faith actors. Next slide, please. The first question, what have we done for creation? I think this question is inviting us, and I think at this point of time, as we are reflecting on the what happened at COP27 and also our preparation for COP27, I think we have, as faith actors and faith leaders, as this community, we have demanded for climate justice. I think this we have been doing this. If you remember, even when we are in Durban, I think that's what 2011, we have faith and we are demanding for climate justice. We have been listening to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. If you remember the theme of the season of creation last year, listening to the voice of the creation. We have been listening to that. We have been doing that. We have been preaching about protection and care for creation because we are faith leaders. We are faith people. We have been teaching. We have been praying together for creation. We have been organizing campaigns. We see the work of SAFCEI or the work of our different faith-based organizations. We have been doing that. We have been attending the COPs. We have been doing that. But again, we also realize that we have not reached. I think this is the point. We have not reached. We are still yet to reach that. Can we go to the second slide, please? So the next question for ourselves is, what are we doing right now? What are we doing for creation? Of course, we still do the same things which we have been doing, demanding for climate justice, listening to the cry of the poor, preaching, praying, organizing, coming, and attending our meetings. We are doing that. These are good things. But again, there is a continuous core here. I think as faith keepers, we have to be part of this as faith keepers. This core for preaching, for praying, is a call for an ecological conversion. That we realize that there is a need for us, ourselves, our brethren, to be reconciled with Mother Earth. What are we doing for creation? We are part of that. We are calling for that. We are calling, we continue to call and to pray for lifestyle changes. We have been hearing from Dr. Augustine, we've been hearing from Dr. Isaac, the situation. And that itself, as faith keepers, asks us that we should ourselves have a lifestyle change, but also continue to call for our lifestyle change, to continue to be stewards of creation, continue to really push this demand for urgent climate action, because we see where we are, but also continue to call for integrity in the way we are going to be dealing with these issues. Honesty in the way we've been talking about money's. We continue to call for honesty. We also continue for generosity of ourselves, of the people, so that all of us, we are in this together. We need to make this change together. Generosity, solidarity. We also continue to ask that we need to keep the promises. So many promises have been made at these COP platforms, but are we keeping them? Are we calling for the keeping of the promises? So this is part of what we are doing as we respond to the cry of the earth, to the cry of the poor. So we do need right now to keep the faith, but more importantly also to keep the mission. And what is that mission? Of protecting and caring for our common home. Now, in terms of the last question, there should have been the question, not the goals of the campaign. The question will be, what more should we be doing? What more should we be doing? I think part of our more, as we move from those other calls, part of our more is that we need to become more prophetic. It's very clear that we need to be more prophetic. We need to be more organized. As faith actors, we are spread out. We are all over, but we need to be more organized. But again, something which we have realized, and we have seen this, as we prepare, as we went to COP 27, and we prepare again for this coming COP, is that we are not prepared. And we need, I think, as of what more should we be doing? We should be doing more about preparations. That these things are not an event. These things have to be prepared for. These things, they should start the moment when we stop another COP. Already we need to start preparing so that we be part of this. We need to be more strategic to know exactly what is it which we need to be talking about. Agreeing on that and being strategic about that. Because if the people whom we are dealing with, they are not people of faith, or they are people of faith, but when sometimes they get into that, those contexts, they change. So we need to be more strategic around this. We need to be more intentional and more present. In these platforms, we need more of us saying with the same voice what we are talking about. So this is the Kairos moment for us. And with that Kairos moment, we are invited to read what are the signs of times as we become more prophetic, more organized, and more prepared. Next slide, please. What is this? What is this signs? What is this thing which is being written on the wall? When we look at the wall, we see what the IPCC latest report has told us. Our situation, that we are in a code red. Where we are right now is a code red situation. We see the extreme weather events happening. And as Dr. Isaac was just talking about the cyclone Freddy and the main cyclone that's been happening. We see what has been happening in Rwanda. We see all over, we see it. This is the writing on the wall. We see how our communities, especially faith keepers, both faith keepers in faith groups, we are at the front lines itself. We see there what's happening in the communities. How the poor people are being impacted. We see those things. We see the pushbacks, because it's physical. We see how people are pushbacks, the spirit of pushing back, of refusing to be converted. We see that pushback. And we see the powerful and the strong of this world, what they are doing. Playing the game, even sometimes, and I think that was what Dr. also Augustine was talking about, that even changing the goalposts, all of a sudden, say, oh, wow, we can actually a little bit go back to the core or something. We see that. We see that doing. So the invitation again, what more should we be doing? We should see more, we should judge, but we should act. So for us, as we see all these things, it is a kairos moment for faith actors, for us as keepers. As we go to COP28, we definitely need to do more. And we've been talking about what is it we should do more. Another interesting thing that this COP28, it is almost like in the belly of the beast, because where we are going to Dubai, which is a whole city built from the fossil fuel. So it's in a way, that is the belly of the beast, because fossil fuel, it is the beast. We are at that source. So how are we going to be prophetic? How are we going to be to witness to what we are talking about in terms of more that should be done by faith keepers? So we do need to do and to be more in telling us in the story of Africa, the story of our experience, the story of how what we are doing, our lifestyles, and this business as usual model is destroying Mother Earth. We need to be calling and demanding the changes that has to be made. Speaking truth to power, truth to powerful, truth to the strong. And we see how the goalposts being changed. We do need to start speaking to truth to the power. But not only speaking truth to the power, but also to speak truth to our people. To say even our people, we are corrupt, we need to change. If these things, we need to be generous, we need to work together. We need also to speak truth to our people. As we become more prophetic, as we become more organized, as we become more prepared, as we become more strategic, as we become more intentional, and as we become more present. Thank you. Last slide. Thank you, Zainab.
Thank you very much, Ngoni. That was very powerful. I'm not following I couldn't follow the comment box, but I will look in a moment. We do have our last speaker, which is Francesca de Gasparis again, our Executive Director, who's going to take us through the dejargonizing the language of the COPing community involved. You on mute, Francesca?
Thank you. The host had to give me permissions. Thank you. What a fascinating series of presentations it has been, and so powerful. My presentation is a little bit of a step back from what we've been hearing so far this morning. What I wanted to do was to talk about what does this all mean, and to think about the accessibility of these terms, of this language, of the history, and really for us to be able to understand the climate change negotiations and process. So I've done a short presentation, which is just the beginning of this. And I've got some resources here, which will also help you to continue on the journey. But this is something we can explore further. And it's something that I personally feel very passionately about, that we need to de-jargon the language of COP, the language of the climate change negotiations. Now I'm going to just put myself onto slideshow, so it's better to be seen. Is that okay? All good?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So what I wanted to do was just give us a little bit of a look into this issue of the climate negotiations. I saw some comments in the chat. Some people in this session, in this Zoom, are extremely knowledgeable about the climate negotiations and may well have been following them for longer than me. And others may be brand new to it. And that should not be a hindrance or a barrier for you and for you to represent your community and to understand, because I think this is very, very important for us as we look at the issue going forward. So I really want to make this as accessible as possible. This is an issue that I've long felt passionately about. I started following the COP negotiations in 2006. They were in Kenya, in Nairobi that year, and have attended them on and off since then, not always, because it's actually quite an overwhelming process. And one has to find one's place in this very big global policy debate, discussion, negotiations. And I think for many of us here, while we might want to have firm analysis and keep our eye on the climate change negotiations, we really want to see change in communities. And certainly that's the ethos of SAFCEI. We believe that we will have been successful, we will have achieved our objectives if we truly see climate resilient communities in Africa. That is what we want to achieve. We want to see people living in harmony with living Earth. And to do so, that means that the issue of climate change will be addressed. So without any further ado, as you well know, I told you at the beginning, and just to say again, this is who SAFCEI is, and this is our commitment to you and to our work together, that we want to really deepen our understanding, deepen our awareness, and thereby deepen our action and the effectiveness of what we can achieve together on eco and climate justice. So the language of climate change, we've heard a lot of it today, and sometimes it's gone over my head too. When people start getting very technical, I can get a little bit lost as well. And that's because unless you're following very, very closely, sometimes you'll see deep, intense arguments in the climate change space around whether an S is included or not. So at one of the COPs, there was a debate about whether we call people indigenous people or indigenous peoples. And the difference of that S allowed for the rights of indigenous people to be recognized or not, for them to have sovereignty as well as the states. And that's why sometimes we can all be held back by the simple thing of an S, because it means that rights will not be recognized. So the issues at hand in the climate change negotiation are huge and complex and often highly technical and often legalese even. And what happens is you end up going down a rabbit hole of acronyms and jargonated language, acronyms being shortenings of terms, jargon being language that only you and the rest of the exclusive club who've been following the issue closely enough know what it means. And every year after a climate change negotiation, we see new language coming out. But our job, I believe, as people of faith and as people who want to see change in reality, in the lived experience of people who are most vulnerable to the issue of climate change, we need to make our language fit to purpose. It needs to be accessible for all of us. And we need to understand it sufficiently well that we don't feel frightened by it, intimidated by it, or as if we're not in the club. What I'm trying to do in my presentation today is throw open the doors of the club and say everyone is welcome in. This isn't a space where you should feel excluded or that because you don't understand, you're not able to enter into the conversation or that your voice doesn't matter. And in particular, you'll notice, and I mentioned this at the beginning, I'm the woman on the panel. For SAFCEI, normally we would like to always have at least 50% women on the panel, because we know that women are some of the vulnerable communities to the impacts of climate change. Women's voices need to be heard. And women indeed are some of the change actors that we see across Africa making a big difference in terms of climate resilience. So men and women hold hands as we address the impact of climate change. So let's talk a little bit about where these negotiations started from. For me, if I'm to understand something, I always want to understand the history. And we've known since the 1970s or before that the Industrial Revolution, or the use of coal, gas and oil, the fossil fuels, has created this global warming or climate change. And finally, in 1992, the countries around the world created an international treaty, which is this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the word we always hear, UNFCCC. It's a framework to allow countries to come together and to negotiate and agree what they're going to do to combat climate change. So like other UN approaches, it really wants everyone to come and be part of the agreements that it creates. And you'll see that in 1995, we finally started really taking these negotiations between the different countries seriously. And we started with the Kyoto Protocol. Now, what's the Kyoto Protocol? It's a legally binding agreement between all the countries of the world, which are known as parties within the convention, to reduce their emission targets. So they need to emit less greenhouse gases, and they had a target. And the way that this legally binding convention was created was to have a commitment period. So the first one was 2008 to 2012, and the second one ended in 2020. And all throughout that period, we were meeting yearly in order to further the negotiations and then to further the commitments and to find out how we are going to address climate change. So when it says there's 197 parties to the convention as a whole, that's the UNFCCC convention, and 192 parties to the Kyoto Convention, that's talking about countries around the world who have signed up to say, yes, we agree. You will notice oftentimes, and this is not a surprise for those of you who follow international agreements, that one of the parties who doesn't agree to the conventions is very often the US of A. United States of America. They often are in these spaces negotiating hard, but then refuse to sign the conventions. It's a great frustration that people feel globally, especially seeing as they've been this global powerhouse throughout this period. So what happened after the Kyoto Protocol? Well, that ran out, right? And so then we started to negotiate globally to make a new agreement. And this was a sense of a lot of frustration for many of people following the negotiations, because we couldn't get a legally binding convention like we'd had with Kyoto. What we got was the Paris Agreement. Now you'll notice something here. The Paris Agreement was adopted in Paris. And that's a clue. And I'll go into this a little bit further on how these conventions and issues around this international negotiation space, how they get named. And then that will help you to unpack and demystify why it is that we keep on having all these different agreements named by places. So the Paris Agreement doesn't have the same legal background to it, but we managed to agree that we do want to limit ourselves to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The negotiations are an incredibly fraught place. It's highly political, and you'll often see that they don't live up to what we want to achieve. So we see an international agreement being hard fought and won, and then we see the countries lagging behind. So when we follow the climate change negotiations, we're looking at it at a number of different levels. This is the international level that we're looking at here. This agreement who is trying to strengthen countries' individual abilities to deal with the impacts of climate change. So the way that these UNFCCC conventions work is each year, the conference of the parties, so it's a conference of all the nations that are involved, they happen in different countries each year, and they cycle through the continents. So we know that last year we had it in Africa, well, very far north in Sharm el-Sheikh. And as I was saying earlier, when you look at something called the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement, you'll see that each one of these meetings has a mechanism, a protocol, an agreement, or a process that is named to the location. So COP22 was held in Marrakesh. So we have the Marrakesh Partnership. The Bali Action Plan came from Indonesia in COP16. And the Glasgow Climate Pact from COP26. For COP27 last year, we had the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan. So this is one of the aspects of the jargon of COP, which we can unpack. We know that each year when it's held in a different nation, we get a pact or an agreement and they start working on that. One of the lovely ones that came out of the Fiji was the Talanoa Dialogues. And that's a particular place that faith actors have felt a strong opportunity to raise our voices. So that's one of the other aspects that's come out of this whole big convention process. And as I said earlier, we know that the nation states or sovereign states are parties to the convention. In other words, most of them have signed up to the convention. And when we go into the negotiations, the negotiators are called state actors. So they represent their different countries and negotiate on their behalf. And then NGOs or faith groupings, we all have observer status. We don't actually have an opportunity to negotiate unless we're invited by one of the parties, but usually we're allowed to observe and we can take part and we can influence. We are, there's no lack of influence. And unfortunately, that also applies obviously to the big industries and corporate interests as well. I'm not looking at the comments, so I hope that if there's anything pressing, someone will alert me. So I'm just going to keep on going. And as people of faith, there are particular ways we can engage into the UNFCCC process. Because it's such a big process and because so much is going on in that space, there's also what we call intersessionals throughout the year. So at the end of the year, it always happens in November or early December that everyone comes together at the next host country. But meanwhile, there's also the intersessionals that happen in Bonn, which are to help move along the technical aspects of the negotiations. Because the way that the negotiations work is that you have experts who negotiate the technical aspects, and then you have the politicians who agree and sign up. So it's a process that moves from technical into the political. And sometimes the technical actors are deadlocked and the politicians unlock the deadlock, and sometimes it's the other way around. So sometimes you see huge movement on the technical side, which then doesn't get adopted by the politicians. So it is a bit of a one step forward, two steps back process. And it's one of the reasons why I don't engage too closely with it. I find the politics of the UNFCCC COP process can be a little bit disheartening. It can make you feel like, well, not enough is ever going to happen to address climate change, which is why I think we always need to be grounded in the lived experience of people of faith, be grounded in our, in faith, in hope, in the sense of that need to have a prophetic voice. I think witnessing gives an incredible capacity for people of faith both to observe and then to also take action without feeling too overwhelmed. And I think it can be incredibly overwhelming when you look at all the different aspects, from mitigation to adaptation, to loss and damage, to finance, and to all the other often very top-down processes that the UNFCCC tries to bring in. And there's many of them. I don't want to overwhelm you in this talk. I could really give you long stories about my experience of working on with the World Bank on the Clean Development Mechanism. How do we implement that? We tried to run a project of that, of indigenous forests, restoring an ecosystem with local communities. These mechanisms aren't fit to the reality on the ground, the truth of working with tenure issues, with needs for clarity on local governance, with the needs of communities needing to be paramount. We can't necessarily solve the problems of climate change through loans and other financial bank mechanisms. So there's a lot of lessons within this negotiation process. There's a lot of knowledge of what hasn't worked and what has worked in the past. But one of my big tips for anyone who's interested in getting more involved is to find an issue that you feel passionately about. Loss and damage is a huge issue for us in Africa. We know that we are not being given sufficient resources to mitigate and adapt. And now we're looking at the impact of loss and damage. As crises happen, how will people be compensated? How will we protect and support families? How will we help communities address the impacts of climate change? So these are huge issues. There isn't ever enough finance to go around to address all of them. And often in the mitigation space, there's a lot of bright ideas, but they don't necessarily translate into real change on the ground. So I think the other advice that I have for engaging with the UNFCCC and the jargon and the acronyms is to really take all of it with a, often they say a pinch of salt. I'm going to say a bucket of salt. Take it, look at it objectively, and look at it as, is this fit for purpose? Will this actually address the needs of my community? And it is our right as to have this information accessible, to be able to understand and to translate this into real life impacts. That's really what the objectives of all of this is. And if it's not happening, then we can raise our voices and say, you people are completely off track. So these are some of the resources that I wanted to share with you around looking at or engaging with, entering into the negotiation process as people of faith. If you haven't done so already, you may have your own mechanisms. There are many excellent faith initiatives, like we heard from Ngoni. There's Laudato Si, the Catholic movement. There's Sinessa, who is also part of that group. There's the World Lutheran Federation. There is the Islamic, I can't remember the name of that organization, but there's many who are indeed coming to COP, attending there within their own faith. The Brahma Kumaris, many others come to COP, are very engaged. And then there's also these interfaith spaces or multi-faith spaces, such as the Interfaith Liaison Committee, the ILC. They meet throughout the year. They recently just had a meeting around their strategy. We are planning something for a Talanoa dialogue for COP28. And I want to welcome you and encourage you to engage if you're planning on going to COP. It's a great space for you to share your knowledge and for you to engage with other faith actors. I think that's really important, to feel the solidarity and also to share what we know. And then there's also the ACT Alliance, a very engaged global alliance of many churches. I think there's over 130 big global religions and other faith actors who've engaged into the ACT Alliance. And it's got a lot of resource and a lot of information that can be shared. So, sorry, I'm just trying to keep scrolling, but my computer seems to, there we go. Right, so just a little bit briefly, and Zainab, please let me know how I'm doing for time, but I wanted to go a little bit into also not just the international aspects of the COP process, but also a little bit into in-country. So, because when we talk about the 197 countries, of course, many of us across Africa are in country, and we want to see what are our states doing in terms of taking this negotiation agreements into in country, and that is often termed the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. It's a commitment that each country has made within the UNFCCC space, and it's a document that says we agree to reduce our emissions by X amount. It's something you can look at. It's something you can hold your government to account on. And these are meant to address this business as usual. And the business as usual, of course, is using fossil fuels to run our economies, to run our countries. We have got to address that and to find a way to change that addiction to fossil fuels. So, and these are some of the ways that we can address this issue of climate change. Carbon budgets with deadlines, having implementation plans that have dates, just like any well-run project. I mean, it's not that different. If you're busy running a project for your church, for your faith community, for the NGO that you work for, you always want to be able to tell everyone else, I want to do this in the next month. This is what we want to do. We all need to meet here on this date. And then we need these materials. It's exactly the same. So the government has created its implementation plans, and these are needed. And we also need legislation and internal mechanisms in country, which will have an impact. So some of the legislation that we should be seeing and that we are seeing across Africa are climate change bills. This is acts and bills which will give government capacity to create effective implementation and enforcement. I think Catherine is drawing lines on my presentation. I don't know, Catherine, if you're doing that on purpose, but maybe you can take those off, or someone can take those off. I don't think I can. Yeah, and then of course, what's very important for us is this term, the just energy transition. This is allowing us to move from the fossil fuel industry onto renewable energy, onto an energy system that will indeed allow us to develop, allow us to be autonomous, allow us to have decentralized, affordable, and accessible energy. And that really is renewable energy. That's one thing that Africa does not have. You know, Africa is such a rich continent. We have got resources in spades, but we need to now make the decision to use them wisely. So one of the debates is, should Africa be able to have a carbon budget to use all of its oil and gas? But if we look at the reality of the atmosphere, if we look at the reality of where we are, if we now go down the route of gas and oil, it's just delaying the inevitable, which is that we also don't need stranded assets. We also don't need to invest in something which is a dead-end road. Let's invest in something that's actually going to bring prosperous development, that's sustainable, that doesn't have a negative environmental impact, and that will give us money in the bank in the future. If we go down oil and gas, what it does is it means now we've got to get away from oil and gas. Now we need to change the way we've developed. So there's an opportunity now for Africa, and we should recognize the opportunity cost of doing the transition now. But the opportunity is to leapfrog over fossil fuels and go straight to renewables, and not get caught in the trap of fossil fuel development. Okay, sorry, my screen is just, hold on, it's not allowing me to move again. So just in summary for what we've been talking about today, I firmly believe that everyone should have access to information, both internationally and nationally. What is the plan that we are making? How are we going to address the impact of climate change? What is our rights as the general public? How can we participate? you'll hear terms like FPIC, free, informed, prior consent. These are international agreements that everyone needs to be given an opportunity to comment and to engage, and it needs consent before we take actions. This is very important when we look at some of the quite outlandish ideas coming out to address climate change. So the climate change bill, which, as I said, a number of countries where we are already have, this is information that should be ready available for everyone. And obviously, we want to see polluters pay, but we want polluters really to pay. We don't want them to get off. We don't want polluters to get let off by paying, by having fines that they can afford and carry on polluting. We really want to see behavior change happen now. And of course, again, all of this from the beginning to the end is about us getting to a point where we're not emitting so many fossil fuels into the atmosphere. So there's another term that you will have heard, net zero by 2050. This means that we are no longer emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There's enough coming back out again, and we've stopped the impact of climate change. So those are some of the areas in which we can engage with the negotiations and that remind the negotiations of the sorts of things that we need to see in country. Okay, I don't know why my computer keeps hanging. Here we go. Finally, I wanted to leave you with some resources. These are just a few resources that I picked out. There are many others. These are clickable links, which I can either put in the chat afterwards, or you can take my presentation and have a look for yourself. It's just to help you unpack some of them. They're resources you can refer back to, get to know some of the acronyms of the Conference of the Parties, of the COPs, look at what are the climate negotiations on about, and always be committed to busting the jargon, finding simple, plain terms, translating it into local languages so that people can understand. And not just local languages. We don't need highly technical translations. What we need is vernacular that can allow us to really access this in a way that makes sense to people. Okay, so that's all from me for today. I would love to continue this conversation, and I'm going to hand back to Zainab for the next part of the morning.
Thank you, Francesca. We're gonna switch over to Tamsin, who's going to do a Mentimeter. Tamsin will explain what a Mentimeter is. Technology isn't my strong point. Tamsin.
Thank you, Zainab. Morning, everybody. I've shared a link in the chat box. We'll be looking at your responses, fact leader responses to COP discourse. I'll be sharing my screen. So this is a word cloud. If you click on the link, when you access the link, you'll be given an option to type in your responses. So you can use one word, or you can use a phrase or a sentence. And yeah, it will be reflected on this blank screen that I have here. So if I can ask you to go to the chat box and have a look at it's a Mentimeter link. And you can type. I'm not, as I'm sharing the presentation, I'm not able to see the responses. So now can you confirm that you see the Mentimeter screen?
I don't.
Oh, okay.
I just shared the link again. So we will look at responses to the COP discourse. Sorry for the noise.
Okay, can you see?
So if you,
now?
it's on its way, I think. It's a bit slow, Tamsin, but I'll let you know. So if everyone can just click on that link and then put down your responses to the COP discourse. Tamsin, you might want to try again. It still says started screen sharing, but nothing.
Yeah, my screen is unfortunately frozen. Okay, there we go. You should see something.
There we
now.
go.
Thanks.
So a few responses have come up: informative, enlightening, what comes next, interesting, lots to learn, participate, have domestic remedies, communication, collective, together. We're just going to give it a few minutes more. We are 45 on this chat, on this online. So we're going to give it a few minutes more. Anything that comes up for you? What's your responses to the COP discourse? Share in local language, very important. Inclusive, together. Hold leaders accountable. Reverend Joshua is saying in the chat box, de-jargonizing the language of climate change is a prerequisite if we are to remove communication barriers with local communities. Tamsin, you can just say when we can stop.
If we can give one more minute just to get some responses. If anyone wants to put in the chat box as well, or instead of the Mentimeter, that's also fine. Thank you.
Everyone has a role. COP care, communication, be empathetic, unity. Lots of wonderful words coming out. This is the time for action, Father Edward Zimba in the chat box. I agree with you, Father Edward. Justice, advocacy, collective accountability.
Just in the interest of time, I will stop sharing my screen, but you can continue typing your inputs on Mentimeter. We'll still collect your inputs there, but I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Tamsin. Are you able to take, like for the Edward's comment, this is the time for action, and then Tobias, community involvement is key. Are you able to take those comments and add it on your side?
Yes, yes, I will. I just want to stop sharing so I can add those. Thank you, Zainab. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tamsin. Thank you, everyone. We had some wonderful presentations from our main speakers and our guest speakers today. Lots to think about, lots of action to be taken, lots of planning to be made, and lots to take in just to make sense of it all and what our responsibility is. Tamsin, I think you're still on share, if I'm not mistaken. No? Okay, I can't see. I'm going to have over to Gabriel for closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Zainab, and thanks to all our presenters for the great work that they have put in place. Maybe briefly before I come to the closing remarks, I noted some questions that are very key. Unfortunately, we couldn't get all our presenters online so that they can be able to respond, and also that Dr. Njamshi had to rush off for a doctor's appointment. But I have seen some comments that are coming from some of the people that are on this meeting. So I would like for us to be able to go through quickly, maybe in 2-3 minutes, some questions that have been asked. One of which stood out for me was, do we have follow-up structures going through faith structures all the way to the grassroots so that we can track COP resolutions and their outcomes? Maybe I would want to throw this one to Francesca, and then I would also ask Ngoni to answer that question.
Thanks, Gabriel, and thank you for that excellent question. I think that for that to work effectively, we need to see our role in it. I would say that the most vulnerable in communities often don't get their voices heard clearly enough. And I think one of the things that we're very interested at SAFCEI is how practitioners who know the reality. So you may be a faith leader in your community and an activist dealing with things like cleaning up the local river or educating people and so on. And then you have the policymakers who are thinking about how they go to the international negotiations. And we have a role to link those two things together. And I think it's for each of us to do as leaders in our own communities. We each have a role to play. Now, some countries have more formal mechanisms than others to do so. Sometimes that's why we do campaigning. When we feel our voices aren't being heard, we want to get on the radio, we want to raise the issue, we want to put pressure on politicians because they're not paying attention to us. Sometimes we do it through quiet advocacy, having a quiet word with someone who's an influencer. Maybe it's the bishop of our, or another senior actor whose voice is able to carry further than perhaps our own are able to carry. Perhaps we even know in someone who's part of the actual negotiations team. I know that some countries civil society is very vibrant. I had a lot of experience of working in Kenya, and there was a very lively debate, and you could quite easily access some of the negotiators. They may not take you that seriously, but at least you can have an engagement and have the conversation. So I personally think that these are political issues, but it's also a personal issue. And it's how we choose to engage. How do I choose to represent my community and the voices of people and others, the non-human as well, also need to have their voices heard. And I can see Josiami is commenting that we have a process for COP feedback that Earth Life Africa in Johannesburg does through monthly meetings. So that's another NGO who's providing a facility for communities in Gauteng, it's part a province in South Africa. So yes, I would say that NGOs have an important role to play. Faiths have an important role to play. It's not a clear line necessarily. And because we are regional here today, I wouldn't want to say this is how you do it, because I think there's different ways that we can be effective. And it's partially who we know, and it's partially what is happening in country in terms of our climate change negotiation processes. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for that. And I think you are also pushing that we are all earth keepers, and each one of us has a role to play. And also as faith leaders, we need to step up and be there for the communities that we represent. Ngoni, would you also want to add on to that? Okay, yeah, it seems not to be close by, but I can see it's still on the call. Maybe we can go on to the next question, which I also felt we can just attempt to answer it on how will the COP resolutions ensure accountability and compliance? That is there a mechanism for ensuring accountability by countries, by individuals, by those that pollute? And also, is there a mechanism for compliance for this? I would have wanted either Dr. Tchuwa or Dr. Njamshi to answer this, but we can also have Francesca and Ngoni to answer, and anybody else who may want to also help in responding. You may please raise your hand, then we can have just a quick discussion now. I have about 5 minutes to do that. So Francesca, in brief, may you also respond to that question? Ngoni, are you still on the, sorry, you are still muted, Francesca?
Thank you, host. The host has to give me permission. I don't know if Ngoni is trying to unmute as well. He's also failing. Let Ngoni go first, please.
All right.
He just can't unmute. Yeah.
Yes, I'm now able to unmute. Thank you. I'm not, Gabriel. I think I'm just going to respond to the first question.
Thank you, Ngoni.
It is clear that that we are now organizing. We are becoming more better. We are now also finding more and more communities in the front line, faith communities at the front line, the rural areas. They're starting really to become, there's an awareness, there's an ecological awareness, there's a climate awareness that is happening. And also the stories are now coming out. And I think that's part of, is now organized groups like ourselves. I think we need to capture now on those stories from the margins, the voices from the margins, and then bring them to these platforms. So it is happening, but it's not enough. More could be done. I think we need to come to a point when we have that critical mass, because the critical mass, that's where change will happen. When the mass is there, we're talking about our responsibility, that we are faith, we are earth keepers, we are people of faith, we are stewards. When that critical mass happen, then the revolution, the ecological revolution, then that does happen as well. But we are getting there, but more could be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think that speaks straight to our hearts that we need to be part of the revolution, and we cannot say others will do it. We are there, and we should also taking our part. And Francesca, just a brief other comment on the issues around accountability and compliance.
I would say that our governments, the international community, have a long way to go. They are very far off compliance and accountability. And it's a constant battle between those in power and those who are watching them and seeing what they do. And to be truly accountable is to be transparent, to share what it is that you are doing, to be inclusive, to give opportunities for feedback and for inputs. And that is accountability. When you share your plan and you then also allow an engagement, that is when you're acting with accountability. So I want to encourage all of us to call for that from our governments, but also to live that. I think it's very important that we always remember that we, how we are in the world also helps others to be that way in the world. So when you overcome your own fear, perhaps to engage in this space and to feel, well, I don't know enough, but I actually want to take action, you are encouraging others to do the same. So I just want to really encourage everyone, as Ngoni says, join the revolution. You don't have to become an expert before you can really be a part of this conversation. All questions matter, and actually asking the simple questions often takes us right back to where we need to be, which is this really going to make a difference? And I think we always need to have that in front and center of our minds.
what is the accountability? Is it really going to reach those who need it? Or is it something with a lot of sound and fanfare around it, but doesn't actually have any real impact? I think those are the questions we need to ask, and always to keep that critical faculty that each of us have well and engaged. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I would also want just to pick some other comments that are coming through that we can also take part. There is what is known as the global stocktake that we can also be involved in. I think in the last month, there's been a call that people could input what they felt has been achieved and what was outstanding. So we would also need to take that into cognizance that as faith leaders, maybe we will be called more to take part. And I think we will be sharing a lot more of the platforms where you can also participate on this. So we thank all of you. We have been passing these comments, and I'll also be taking some of these comments and pushing them to our expert presenters, Dr. Njamshi and Dr. Tchuwa, so that we will also respond and share on this. We'll be creating maybe a Google group for the people that attended this meeting so that we'll be able to share the information on email. But just in terms of my closing remarks, I would really want to say the call is that we are supposed to be getting there together, to work and to contribute something towards making this place a better place to be. And I think what was pointed out by Dr. Njamshi was that we have reached the 1.1 degrees Celsius position, which for Africa means we have actually exceeded 2 degrees Celsius. And this is why we are now living in the impact of climate crisis that we are in. What we are seeing now is a result of what has been building up over the years, and we are supposed to be responding. And how do we do that? Through advocacy, lobbying, and campaigns. And let it start from each and every one of us. In our next faith community meeting, be it at the mosque, at church, at temple, or wherever, let us take time for us to share. We are already living in a very, very dangerous period, as was said by Ngoni, that we are now in code red. And when we are in code red, we cannot afford anymore to sit back and say others would act. It is for us to step up and be counted and act in our different communities. Let me speak the word to my neighbor. Let me speak the word at church or at mosque. Somebody should hear that we are in code red and allow for all our efforts to come together so that we build the greater force that Ngoni and Francesca mentioned. We need to be all there and be counted. And also, you realize that when the presentation on loss and damage was being said, that the local actions need to come into force. So let us document and let us quantify the losses that people in our communities are suffering because of the impact of our climate change. The droughts, the floods, and any other which are part of the multi-crisis that we are facing, particularly in Southern Africa. Let's document that and let's give these presentations to government to say this is what has happened in our communities, so that we will want to see this information being used at the platforms that government actors go to at COPs and other meetings. And as was also said, we need to be able to now to start getting the language that everybody would understand, to have the language that communities will participate in. And also, as one of the participants said, that we would need to be the ones that are giving the guidance and the support to the communities where we are coming from. Let us source for the information. As Francesca has already said, we have the resources. Let us all try to get the resources and share with others so that we'll be able to hold our councillor, our member of parliament, and those leaders that are in our communities to account for what they are doing as far as climate crisis is concerned. It is important that we help others to access the information, and that we should also be the points where information is found in our different communities. Let us be those people that are willing to share what is happening around us. We know better than others in our communities. Let us try to say this is the information that is there and to help them to act. As we are always saying, we need to think globally but act locally. What is your role? What are you able to do, and what are you actually doing? And lastly, I think we would actually need to have a look at the fact that when we are looking at climate change, it's not something that is happening somewhere, but it is something that is causing loss of lives of the people that we know. I think in the past, we used to hear of things happening far away, but now I think more and more, we have names of people that we know who have lost their lives. This is what the impact of the climate crisis has done to our communities. It makes infrastructure disappear. It also makes our sources of food disappear. It causes loss of biodiversity. And this is something that is of concern to all of us people of faith. So these are my closing remarks, and my call is for each and every one of us to play a part, starting from your home, to your community, to your faith community, to your local community, as well as in your country. And let's have a regional voice together. We thank you all for coming. I'll now want to hand back to our events director, Zainab, to get us to the close. But I want to thank all of you for making an effort to come through. I realized that there were some who were failing to get onto the call, but I thank all of you for making that effort to keep on trying to join the call, and all the best to all of you. I would like to thank all of you. We'll actually be having more work coming on board, and we'll notify you on time on some of the activities that we'll be doing as far as the issues of the environment are concerned, from the food and the climate justice desk and all the other desks that Francesca has mentioned. So thank you all, and we really felt the warmth of your presence and also of your contribution. Thank you so much. Keep talking about the environment and the climate. Over to you, Zainab.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. What a strong ending to today with this very strong message. I do hope, I can't speak for you, but I do hope that we are going to have more of these sessions to inform faith leaders and to inform ourselves what we need, the message that we want to take forward. And to make it stronger. I'm going to ask Sheikh Kasim, you didn't look at your chat box. Are you able to close us with the prayer, please?
Maybe one photo, if everybody could just
oh yes, sorry,
for us to have the photo.
Thank you very much. Can everyone switch on their cameras, please? I'm seeing all these beautiful, familiar faces. Tetu, Royce, Reverend Joshua, Catherine. Our photographer is just taking screenshots. Please let me know when you're done. Nice smile, everyone. Andrea, I love your comment. Another one. Just a few seconds more. Keep the smile. Keep the smile. And smile. Those that's camera is still off, please, could you switch it on? Vincent, please sit still.
Thank you. You can now go for the closing prayer.
Thank you very much, everyone. Sheikh Kasim, your mic is unmuted. Can we start with you? And then I'm going to ask Catherine. I saw you, Catherine. Please, could you share a prayer with us after Sheikh Kasim? Thank you. Sheikh. Sheikh Kasim, can you close us with a prayer, please? Can you unmute Sheikh Kasim?
Yes, am I being heard?
Yes, you are. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My closing prayer, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious and most merciful, all praises are due to you, O Lord of creations. Lord, make us submissive to thee in protecting the earth and raise from our offsprings a nation submitting to thee, and show us our ways of devotion and turn to us mercifully. Surely show us at the of returning and merciful. We thank you for being with us during the entire session, and then we pray that whatever has been discussed here should be implemented by all of us here. We ask this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sheikh Kasim. Can we just ask Catherine to do a short prayer? Can you unmute Catherine, please?
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Catherine.
Okay. Shall we pray? Lord our Father, we thank you for the time we have given to us to discuss issues pertaining to our lives. We ask you to guide us so that we put whatever has been discussed into practice. With your guidance, we know, Lord, you can do better. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen.
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 Thank you very much, Catherine.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining. We hope to see you at the next one, which you will obviously hear about in future sometime.
You're welcome.
So thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
MashaAllah.
Lovely
Bye.
seeing you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.